All right, let's get into it because there's a lot going on across the map right now and almost none of it is boring. Here's something that sounds almost impossible, but it's exactly what's shaping up on the maps right now. Next week, some parts of the country could still be baking under triple-digit heat, while other parts of the country are seeing their very first frost of the season. Two completely different seasons happening at the exact same time, separated by only a couple thousand miles of land. And that cold air pushing in out west isn't just a small local story for one region tucked away in the mountains. It's connected to a bend developing in the jet stream, and that bend is going to shove the heat farther east while it starts rearranging the entire storm track across the middle of the country. So what we're really trying to figure out today is whether this is just a brief blip, a quick interruption in a pattern we've been stuck in for what feels like the entire summer, or whether this is actually the first real crack in that pattern, the first legitimate attempt at breaking the heat that's dominated the second half of the season so far. Let's start out west, because that's where this whole chain reaction begins. Somewhere around September 3rd through the 5th, the Climate Prediction Center is drawing attention to a stretch of much colder than normal temperatures settling in across the northern Great Basin, the northern Rockies, and the northern High Plains. And this isn't just one model showing it either, which is really what makes it worth paying attention to. Both the American ensemble and the European ensemble are increasingly aligned on lows dropping below 40 degrees across a good chunk of that region, and in the higher elevations, some spots could actually bottom out around freezing 32 degrees. That's more than just a chilly morning where you need an extra layer. That's genuinely cold enough to produce the first frost or freeze of the season in those areas, and it's arriving earlier than a lot of people out that way are probably expecting. Now, to be fair, frost showing up in the mountains in early September isn't some rare, once-in-a-generation event. We are heading into September after all, and these are naturally some of the colder corners of the country to begin with, so a touch of frost this time of year isn't shocking on its own. But what actually caught my attention wasn't the frost itself, it was how quickly the broader weather pattern around it is shifting. Here's the mechanism behind it, and it's worth walking through step by step because it explains almost everything else we're going to talk about today. A big ridge of high pressure is going to build up over the northeastern Pacific. When that ridge builds, it forces the jet stream to bend southward on the other side of it, and that bend digs a trough down into the western United States. That trough essentially becomes a highway, a clear path for cold air to spill south out of Canada and drop into the northern Rockies and Great Basin. But here's the part that makes this more than just a regional cold snap story, and honestly, it's the part that makes this whole setup worth talking about at all. Once the jet stream bends that dramatically out west, it doesn't just affect the west. It starts rearranging the weather pattern much farther east as well, almost like a chain reaction working its way across the entire country. The heat ridge that has been parked over the southern United States for what feels like the entire summer at this point is going to get nudged eastward by this whole setup. So in a strange, almost ironic twist, one of the very first effects of this cold shot out west might actually be another surge of intense heat for a whole different set of people living farther east. The Weather Prediction Center is already expecting dangerous late summer heat to expand out of the southern plains and push into the Mississippi Valley and the Mid-South. From there, it continues marching toward the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, the South, and the Southeast as we move into next week. This isn't a minor bump in temperatures either. By September 3rd, forecasters have already outlined a moderate risk of extreme heat stretching from parts of the central and southern plains through the Mississippi Valley and into the western sections of the Tennessee and Ohio valleys. That means there are still going to be areas seeing highs in the 95 to 100 degree range, and in the more humid pockets farther south, heat indices could climb well above 110 degrees, which is genuinely dangerous territory for anyone spending extended time outdoors. So if you live in Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, or Ohio, or really anywhere near that general stretch of the country, don't let the pleasant weather happening right now fool you into thinking summer has already wrapped up. A lot of that area is currently enjoying a noticeably drier, more comfortable stretch of days. Honestly, this coming Friday looks genuinely nice across a lot of these spots. The kind of day you'd want to spend outside without thinking twice about it. But the comfort is temporary because that ridge is getting ready to slide right back in your direction. Once September actually arrives on the calendar, summer might come roaring back with it, and it could catch some people off guard after a few days of relief. There's another reason the placement of this ridge matters so much beyond just the raw temperatures, and it has to do with what happens along its northern edge. This is where things start to connect to a completely different kind of weather risk. When you get a large dome of heat parked over the central and southern United States, smaller disturbances riding through the jet stream can ride right along the top of that dome, almost like they're skimming across the surface of it. They tend to originate out of the northern plains, track through the upper Midwest and Great Lakes, and then sometimes dive southeast into the Ohio Valley, the Mid-Atlantic, and even up into the Northeast. The Storm Prediction Center has already started making mention of this general setup in their outlooks heading into next week, which tells you they're at least keeping an eye on it, even if nothing is locked in yet. There's nothing formally highlighted in terms of a specific severe weather risk area at this point, but they are watching the larger ridge building across the plains, and they're watching that northwest flow extending from the upper Midwest all the way toward the mid-Atlantic and northeast. In plain terms, that means the winds several miles above the surface are lining up in a way that lets these little disturbances ride along the top of the heat dome, dive down into the southeast, and slam directly into a reservoir of warm, humid air sitting underneath them. That combination, cool disturbances riding over top of warm, humid air, is exactly the kind of setup that can spark some serious thunderstorm activity. And if that sounds familiar to anyone in Illinois, it absolutely should, because this is essentially the exact pattern that has been hammering that state all summer long without much of a break. Illinois has had 209 tornadoes confirmed this year. 209 based on actual damage surveys conducted on the ground, not just preliminary reports called in that later get downgraded or thrown out. And on top of that confirmed number, there have been more than 300 total tornado reports across the state this year when you include everything that came in. To put that number in real context, the old state record for tornadoes in a single year was 142, and that record was only set 2 years ago, which means this year has already blown past a record that felt significant at the time it was set. The average number of tornadoes Illinois typically sees in any given year is 54. 54 is the normal. 209 is what's happened this year. So this year, Illinois has become only the second state in recorded history to ever reach 200 tornadoes in a single year. And it managed to do that with roughly a fifth of the land area of Texas, which makes the number even more remarkable when you think about it geographically. The all-time record for any state belongs to Texas, which had 244 tornadoes back in 2015. Illinois needs just 35 more tornadoes to tie that record, and 36 to break it outright. And with 4 months still left in the year, that is very much within reach given how the season has gone so far. Indiana has already broken its own state tornado record too, so this isn't purely an Illinois story, it's really a regional story playing out across multiple states. Now, some of these tornado totals came from a handful of major, widely covered outbreaks earlier in the season, the kind of events that made national news and stuck in people's minds. But a lot of the recent additions to that count have been coming from exactly the kind of setup we're discussing right now. Storms riding that northwest flow along the edge of the ridge, happening over and over again throughout the summer in a fairly repetitive pattern. So if one of these upcoming disturbances arrives at just the right time next week, it could organize into a cluster of thunderstorms. And as we've clearly seen play out this year, those clusters can sometimes turn strong or severe with very little warning. It's still too early to know exactly which wave in this pattern is going to end up mattering most. And that's an honest limitation of the forecast at this range. And again, the Storm Prediction Center hasn't put out a specific severe weather outlook for any of this just yet, so we're really talking about a setup worth monitoring rather than a confirmed threat. But if you live anywhere from the northern plains through the Great Lakes, the Midwest, or the Ohio Valley, next week has the potential to swing from hot and humid straight into stormy conditions in a hurry. And that's worth keeping in mind as you plan out the coming days. Now let's shift gears and look over at the western side of the country, because the Pacific Ocean is the reason a completely different part of the country is going to end up with a very different result from everything we've just discussed. And honestly, the Pacific has basically lost its mind lately. There's really no other way to put it. Just earlier this week, the Hurricane Center was tracking 7 separate systems scattered between Mexico and Hawaii, all at the exact same time, which is an unusually crowded stretch of ocean even for a busy season. And on top of that, there was also a typhoon spinning on the other side of the ocean simultaneously. So the entire Pacific Basin has essentially been working overtime. Meanwhile, if you look over at the Atlantic, it's told almost the opposite story all season long. There have been a handful of weak storms that fizzled quickly, but not a single hurricane has formed yet, as of this point in the year. This has been essentially the quietest start to an Atlantic hurricane season in roughly 40 years, which is a pretty striking contrast to what's been happening on the other side of the country. That said, Tropical Storm Dolly did form just this morning, only 2 days after the world lost Dolly Parton, which felt like a strange little coincidence worth pausing on for a moment while pulling up the satellite loop and watching it spin. But just like its namesake was beloved rather than fearsome, this storm isn't going to be very mean either, at least based on where it's headed and how it's expected to behave. It's moving west at around 25 miles per hour, and the Hurricane Center expects it to fall apart entirely before it ever reaches the Leeward Islands, so it's not expected to become a real threat to land. The split personality between an unusually active Pacific and an unusually quiet Atlantic is largely being driven by El Nino, which is influencing both basins at the same time in opposite directions. There's actually a much deeper dive coming on how El Nino is likely to shape the upcoming winter across the country. But that's a story for another video down the road. For now, here's why all that Pacific activity actually matters. For this weekend specifically, and it ties directly back into everything we've already covered. All of that extra moisture being generated by these storms out in the Pacific has to go somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. And this developing trough and ridge pattern is going to end up pulling a good amount of it northward into Arizona and New Mexico. There's been a highlighted risk for heavy rainfall building over southern Arizona and into southwestern New Mexico for a little while now, something worth flagging across the last couple of videos, and that risk becomes especially relevant somewhere around September 5th through the 7th. So while the Northwest is getting hit with colder air and the heat ridge is getting pushed farther east into the plains and Mississippi Valley, the desert Southwest may end up dealing with a surge of tropical moisture, moving in from an entirely different direction altogether, making for a genuinely complicated few days on the weather map. This could also set up a fairly dramatic turnaround for parts of the Northwest, and this is one of the more encouraging pieces of this whole story. Right now, portions of Oregon, Nevada, and Southern California are dealing with critical fire weather conditions. Very dry air, strong gusty winds, dried out vegetation, and active fires already burning across parts of that region. Then, roughly a week later, as we've been discussing throughout this video, some of that same general region could be dealing with temperatures cold enough to produce frost. The outlook specifically notes that this incoming colder air could help ease some of the fire weather concerns currently affecting that region, which would be a genuinely welcome shift for anyone dealing with those dangerous conditions right now, whether that's residents, firefighters, or anyone monitoring air quality out there. If we look farther east again, there's one significant factor working against a quick end to the heat, and it's worth mentioning because it complicates the otherwise hopeful story about the trough breaking things down. Parts of the central and southern plains, along with the Mississippi Valley, are drying out extremely fast at the moment. There's been a highlighted risk for rapid onset drought conditions across some of these areas for quite a while now, and that's an important piece of the puzzle because dry ground heats up noticeably faster than wet ground does. It's a simple physical relationship, but it matters a lot here. So, if that ridge ends up sticking around longer than currently expected, which is very possible given how things have played out so far this summer, that drying trend could actually help sustain and reinforce the hot pattern for even longer than currently forecast, essentially feeding back into itself. This brings up what might be the single biggest open question in this entire forecast right now, which is simply this. What happens after the cold air finishes pushing into the northwest? The models are in solid agreement on the first several moves in this sequence, and that agreement is honestly reassuring given how uncertain long-range forecasting can be. The trough digs into the west, the northwest cools down, the heat ridge gets shoved eastward. Everyone agrees on that much, no real disagreement there. But after that point, the models start to diverge significantly, and this is where things get genuinely interesting to watch play out over the coming days. The European model takes the trough and pushes it eastward, gradually eating away at the ridge as it goes. If that solution ends up being correct, cooler air would eventually spread into the middle of the country later on, offering some real relief. The American model, on the other hand, keeps that trough essentially parked out west and holds onto the ridge much longer. If that version turns out to be right, the South stays hot, and the Midwest continues riding that same storm corridor along the northern edge of the ridge, which means more of the setup we just talked about with Illinois and the surrounding states. You can actually see this disagreement playing out in real time if you look at the official outlooks day to day. Just yesterday, there was a high risk of extreme heat highlighted for this particular window coming up. Today, that same area has been downgraded to a moderate risk. The core numbers haven't really changed all that much when you look closely. 95 to 100 degree temperatures are still very much on the table for a lot of areas. What actually shifted was the confidence level in exactly how long the worst of that heat is going to stick around, which is a subtle but meaningful change. And at the very same time, that cold signal out west has strengthened enough that it's now made it onto the official hazards map from the Climate Prediction Center, which is a notable development given how quiet that side of the map has been for a while. For weeks now, this heat ridge has essentially been the dominant feature that everybody else in the pattern has had to work around, the thing everything else bends to accommodate. And now, for the first time in a while, there's finally a trough out there with enough strength to genuinely disturb the pattern we've been locked into for so long, which is exactly why this whole setup deserves attention even before it fully plays out. To be clear, none of this means that fall is suddenly taking over the entire country next week just because we're talking about a first frost somewhere out west. There's still a very good chance that a lot of intense, uncomfortable heat is going to stick around for a meaningful stretch of time across large portions of the country, especially through the South and into parts of the Midwest. But for the first time in a while, there's at least a legitimate player showing up on the map that could eventually help usher that heat out of here. Eventually being the key word there, because this isn't a quick fix by any means. The overall outlook for September as a whole still contains plenty of warmth built into it, so nobody should be putting away the shorts and sandals just yet. But the days are getting shorter, the sun angle is dropping lower with each passing week, and because of that seasonal shift, every trough that comes through from here on out has a slightly better shot at actually making progress than it would have back in the middle of July, when the odds were stacked heavily against it. So here's the honest bottom line on all of this. After walking through everything from the frost out west to the tornado numbers in Illinois to the tropical moisture heading into the desert southwest, this first real cold punch of the season probably isn't going to bring summer to an end for most of the country. And if you're hoping for an immediate turn toward fall weather everywhere, that's probably not what's coming next week. But it is going to do something we genuinely haven't seen much of lately, which is actually challenge the pattern that's been running the show since roughly June. That in itself is worth paying attention to, even if the immediate impact is limited to specific regions. If that western trough manages to keep making progress eastward over the coming days, this could end up being remembered as the first real attempt at breaking the grip of late summer heat that's dominated the season. If instead it stalls out west and gets stuck there, essentially running out of momentum before it can make real progress, the heat simply reloads and picks right back up where it left off, and we could be looking at more of the same pattern for a while longer. And for anyone living across the Midwest, the Great Lakes, or the Ohio Valley, the thing to really keep an eye on isn't the frost out west at all, even though that's the flashier part of the story. It's the timing of those disturbances riding over the top of that ridge, the small waves in the jet stream that could organize into clusters of severe thunderstorms given the right conditions underneath them. That's the piece of this pattern that ultimately determines whether next week ends up being something we're simply watching from a distance out of curiosity, or something that demands real attention because of the genuine, severe weather potential tied to it. Given how the season is already gone, with record tornado numbers in Illinois and Indiana, that's not a risk anyone in those areas should take lightly, and it's exactly the kind of setup worth continuing to track closely as we get closer to next week and the details start to firm up. If you step all the way back and try to look at this as one connected story, rather than a handful of separate regional forecasts, what you're really looking at is a single pattern change, trying to work its way across the entire country, touching almost every region in a different way. Out west, it shows up as the first frost of the season and a bit of relief from fire weather. In the middle of the country, it shows up as one more surge of dangerous heat before anything actually improves. Across the Midwest and Ohio Valley, it shows up as a continuation of the severe weather threat that's already made this one of the most active tornado years on record for a couple of states. And down in the desert southwest, it shows up as a burst of tropical moisture riding in from a Pacific Ocean that's been unusually active all season long. All four of those stories are connected to the exact same trough digging in out west. And that's honestly what makes this particular pattern shift worth spending an entire video on, instead of just a quick mention in passing. It's also worth remembering that forecasts at this range, roughly a week to 10 days out, are always going to carry some uncertainty. And that's exactly why the models splitting after the first few days isn't surprising or alarming on its own. This is completely normal for a pattern change of this size. What matters is that the two solutions, the European model's more progressive, eastward-moving trough and the American model's more stubborn, parked-in-place trough, actually represent two very different outcomes for tens of millions of people. The one version means meaningful relief from the heat spreading into the middle of the country before too long. The other version means more of the same hot, humid, storm-prone pattern that's already produced a historic tornado season in parts of the Midwest. So even though we can't say with confidence which one wins out yet, it's worth understanding both possibilities now so that none of it comes as a surprise once the picture becomes clearer over the next several days. We'll obviously keep tracking this closely as we get deeper into next week, especially once the Storm Prediction Center starts sharpening up its outlooks and the Climate Prediction Center updates its temperature and precipitation outlooks with more confidence. And the frost out west, the heat surge in the middle of the country, the storm risk in the Midwest and Ohio Valley, and the tropical moisture heading into the desert southwest are all pieces of the same evolving picture. And each one is going to keep shifting slightly as we get closer to the actual dates. So don't lock in on any single detail just yet, especially anything more than 5 or 6 days out, but do keep an eye on how that western trough behaves over the next couple of forecast cycles, because that's really the thread that ties this entire story together. One more thing worth sitting with before wrapping up is just how unusual it is to have this many active weather stories overlapping at the same time. A near record-breaking tornado season still adding numbers by the week, an Atlantic hurricane season that's about as quiet as it's been in 4 decades, a Pacific Ocean juggling 7 systems at once, plus a typhoon, a drought developing fast enough to actually feed back into the heat sitting on top of it, and now a trough digging into the west that's strong enough to challenge a pattern that has felt almost permanent since early summer. Any one of those on its own would be a solid story. Having all of them line up in the same week is what makes this particular stretch of weather worth watching so closely, and it's exactly why the next several days on the forecast models matter as much as they do.